Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Watana has documented hundreds of attacks, killing and maiming thousands of civilians and destroying key infrastructure. We found U.S. bomb remnants at dozens of these airstrikes. Many are likely war crimes. Every single one destroyed innocent lives.
As Yemen faces the world's worst humanitarian crisis, a new study shows U.S. and British bombs have killed and injured over 1,000 Yemenis during the Saudi-led war. We'll speak with a leading Yemeni human rights activist who just testified on Capitol Hill. Then we look at how the U.S. is also arming the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia's ally in the Yemen war.
Well, the United States is enabling war crimes by the United Arab Emirates in Yemen by supplying arms and training. We're the biggest arms supplier. And the UAE has engaged in torture. They've armed mercenaries and militias. They put U.S. arms even in the hands of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, even the Houthi opposition. So basically, they've been an irresponsible partner, and they're really partners in crime with Saudi Arabia in that war.
But first, the Senate holds a confirmation hearing for retired General John Abizaid to become U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. This comes just days after Jared Kushner traveled to the kingdom for a secretive meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the man accused of ordering the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen defended President Trump's declaration of a national emergency at the southern border Wednesday, telling lawmakers in a contentious hearing officials are on track to detain more than 900,000 migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border this year. Nielsen pushed back against widespread reports the Trump administration routinely denies migrants a chance to apply for asylum in the U.S., claiming no one would be turned away at a U.S. port of entry. The claim prompted Democrat Nanette Barragan of the House Homeland Security Committee to reply, "You're either lying to this committee or you don't know what's happening at the border," she said. Asked how many children are detained at the border, Nielsen replied she didn't have the number handy. And she denied that migrant prisoners are being held in cages. This is New Jersey Congressmember Bonnie Watson-Coleman questioning Nielsen.
What is a chain link fence enclosed into a chamber on a concrete floor represent to you? Is that a cage?
It's a detention space, ma'am, that you know has existed for decades.
Does it differ from the cages you put your dogs in when you let them stay outside? Is it different?
Yes.
In what sense?
It's larger. It has facilities. It provides room to sit, to stand, to lay down.
So did my dog's cage.
Secretary Nielsen's testimony came as U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported its agents arrested over 66,000 people crossing the southern border between legal ports of entry in February, the highest number for a single month in nearly 10 years. A new report finds the investigative arm of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, maintained a secret list of New York City activist groups that protested Trump administration policies. A 4-page document obtained by The Nation magazine titled Anti-Trump Protest Spreadsheet shows Homeland Security investigations kept tabs on a series of protests held in New York over a 17-day period last summer, targeting white supremacy, deportations, and the National Rifle Association. None of the demonstrations appear to be linked to HSI's mandate to investigate cross-border criminal activity. One of the protests surveilled by HSI was a rally responding to a neo-Nazi group's display of a racist banner organized by Congressmember Adriano Espaillat. He told The Nation, quote, "I would like to find out why our event was on that list and whether it was surveilled or infiltrated and why the racist anti-Semitic group was not on the list," he said. Meanwhile, in San Diego, California, newly revealed documents show the U.S. government created a secret database of activists and journalists who were documenting the Trump administration's efforts to thwart a caravan of migrants hoping to win asylum in the U.S. last year. An investigation from San Diego's NBC7 revealed the list was shared among Homeland Security Investigations, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and the FBI. It included the names of 10 journalists, 7 of whom were U.S. citizens, along with nearly 4 dozen others listed as organizers or instigators. Some of the journalists and at least one immigration lawyer had alerts placed on their passports that prevented them from entering Mexico. Others on the list reported they were stopped by Mexican police or were subjected to lengthy interviews and searches when re-entering the United States. President Trump revoked a rule Wednesday requiring that the Director of National Intelligence report annually on civilians killed by U.S. drone strikes outside official war zones. The Trump administration was already in violation of the reporting requirement, which the White House ignored as a deadline came and went last May. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism reports President Trump has further accelerated the U.S. drone assassination program with over 2,200 drone strikes during Trump's first 2 years in office, more strikes than occurred over 8 years under President Obama. In news from Yemen, a major new report from several human rights groups details the role that the U.S. and Europe have played in the deaths of hundreds of civilians in the U.S.-backed Saudi and UAE-led war on Yemen. The report found between April 2015 and April 2018, 27 coalition attacks killed at least 203 civilians and injured at least 749 people. At least 22 of the attacks likely involved weapons produced in the United States. We'll have more on the report later in the broadcast. In Syria, Kurdish-led forces backed by the United States say they captured 400 ISIS fighters Wednesday who were fleeing the group's last stronghold in eastern Syria. Their reported capture came as 2,000 civilians fled the town of Baghouz near the Iraqi border. Meanwhile, President Trump has reversed his promise made in a tweet last December to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. In a handwritten response to a February 22nd letter from senators requesting the U.S. keep a contingent of hundreds of troops in Syria, Trump wrote, "I agree 100%. Back on Capitol Hill, Arizona Republican Senator Martha McSally revealed Wednesday she was raped by a superior officer when she served in the U.S. Air Force. Senator McSally, a former Air Force colonel who was the first female fighter pilot to fly in combat, made the disclosure during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on rampant sexual assault in the U.S. military.
The perpetrators abused their position of power in profound ways. And in one case, I was preyed upon and then raped by a superior officer. I stayed silent for many years, but later in my career, as the military grappled with scandals and their wholly inadequate responses, I felt the need to let some people know I too was a survivor. I was horrified at how my attempt to share generally my experiences were handled. I almost separated from the Air Force at 18 years over my despair. Like many victims, I felt the system was raping me all over again.
Pentagon figures show in 2017, the most recent year for which data are available, there were nearly 6,800 reports of sexual assault involving members of the military. Those sexual assaults are still dramatically underreported in military ranks. A 2011 survey estimated 26,000 people were sexually assaulted in the military that year alone, with women soldiers far more likely to be raped by fellow soldiers than killed in combat. A second federal judge has ruled against the Trump administration's decision to put a citizenship question on the 2020 census, setting up a likely challenge at the Supreme Court. U.S. District Judge Richard Seaborg of California ruled Wednesday the move is unconstitutional because it prevents the government from carrying out its mandate of conducting the census every 10 years. In January, a federal judge in New York also ordered a halt to the census's citizenship question, ruling U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross violated federal rules and, quote, alternately ignored, cherry-picked, or badly misconstrued the evidence in the record before him, unquote. Voting rights activists say the question is meant to deter immigrants from participating in the census, leading to a vast undercount in states with large immigrant communities. This would impact everything from the redrawing of congressional maps to the allocation of federal funds. President Trump's former personal attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, was back on Capitol Hill Wednesday for a fourth day of congressional testimony. Cohen and his legal team were photographed lugging several suitcases and briefcases into a closed-door session with the House Intelligence Committee, suggesting Cohen provided Congress with hundreds of new documents detailing his dealings with the Trump Organization. Cohen reportedly provided evidence showing White House lawyer Jay Sekulow edited Cohen's false 2017 testimony to Congress about the Trump Organization's plans to build a skyscraper in Moscow. Texas officials and the Environmental Protection Agency barred NASA scientists from studying the release of toxic chemicals in and around Houston in the wake of Hurricane Harvey in 2017. That's according to the Los Angeles Times, which reports NASA scientists were stunned after they were barred from flying a jet over Houston equipped with sophisticated air samplers that would have helped to identify areas where toxic releases posed a threat to human health. Hurricane Harvey inundated the Texas coast with record rainfall, dropping more than 60 inches of rain over the course of a few days. The area is home to thousands of oil refineries and petrochemical plants, as well as over a dozen Superfund sites. To see Democracy Now! Coverage of that hurricane and the aftermath, go to democracynow.org. The Trump administration's proposing ending endangered species protections for gray wolves in the lower 48 states. Critics say the move would endanger the estimated 5,000 gray wolves currently living in the continental United States, excluding Alaska. In a statement, the Western Environmental Law Center said, quote, allowing people to kill wolves in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana has already stunted recovery in those states. Applying the same death sentence to wolves throughout the contiguous U.S. would nationalize these negative effects with potentially catastrophic ripple effects on ecosystems wherever wolves are found today. The Food and Drug Administration's confirmed that makeup products from two popular brands of cosmetics contain the carcinogenic substance asbestos. FDA tests of 3 powdered makeup products from Claire's and 1 from the brand Justice tested positive for asbestos, which can cause lung disease and cancer. Americans spend some $60 billion a year on cosmetics throughout the industry, though the industry is largely unregulated. Congress last approved regulations on makeup in 1938. In Chicago, police arrested R&B singer R. Kelly Wednesday, charging him with failure to pay more than $160,000 in child support. Kelly's arrest came less than 2 weeks after he was arrested and charged with 10 counts of aggravated criminal sexual assault against 4 women and girls, 3 of whom were under the age of consent at the time. His arrest Wednesday came just hours after he was seen screaming and cursing during an interview with Gayle King, broadcast on CBS this morning.
I didn't do this stuff. This is not me, y'all. I'm fighting for my life. Y'all killing me with this. I gave y'all 30 years of my career.
Robert.
30 years of my career. Y'all trying to kill me.
After months of mounting criticism about Facebook's lack of privacy protection, CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced Wednesday he will be shifting the social media giant from focusing on publicly sharing information to private communication. Zuckerberg said he would do this in part by integrating Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger, which are all platforms that he controls, and by allowing communication to be deleted instead of remaining on the internet permanently. Lawmakers have introduced legislation to restore Obama-era net neutrality rules that were gutted by the Trump administration. The changes, approved in 2017 in a 3-2 vote by Republican commissioners on the FCC, pave the way for the Internet service providers to throttle Internet traffic speeds according to how much customers pay or based on the websites they wish to favor. The Save the Internet Act, introduced by congressional Democrats Wednesday, would bar telecom companies from blocking, throttling, or otherwise interfering with Internet access. This is New York Democratic Congressmember Yvette Clarke.
The Republican FCC has dismantled net neutrality, saddling consumers with higher costs and less choice, throttling competition and punishing entrepreneurs, small businesses, communities of color, and other Americans who are vulnerable and disenfranchised. This is the 21st century issue of equity.
And House Democrats have delayed plans to vote on a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. The resolution is seen as a direct rebuke of recent comments by Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar questioning the U.S. relationship with Israel, even though the draft resolution does not explicitly name the freshman congressmember. The resolution was announced after comments by Omar at an event last week in which she called out the political influence in this country that says it's okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country, referring to Israel. Omar has repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism. The vote has been indefinitely delayed Wednesday after a revolt from progressive Democrats. In a statement to the Hill, Senator Bernie Sanders wrote, quote, "We must not equate anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism of the right-wing Netanyahu government in Israel. Rather, we must develop an even-handed Middle East policy which brings Israelis and Palestinians together for a lasting peace," Sanders said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin with a number of recent developments in U.S.-Saudi relations. On Monday, the Trump administration gave a private briefing to senators on the investigation into the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in October. Senators slammed the briefing for providing no new information. Lawmakers have accused the Trump administration of covering up the role of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in ordering the killing. A number of Republican senators criticized the briefing. Lindsey Graham called the briefing worthless. Marco Rubio called it, quote, not the right approach. John Barrasso said, quote, I'm not happy. The briefing came just days after President Trump's advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner made a secretive trip to Saudi Arabia to meet with King Salman and the Saudi Crown Prince. The Daily Beast reports officials and staffers in the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh were not told the details of Kushner's trip, and no one from the embassy took part in the meetings. Meanwhile, the New York Times has revealed new details about the jailing and torture of a doctor with U.S. citizenship in Saudi Arabia. Walid Fatehi is a Harvard-trained doctor who's been jailed without charge since 2017. He was first detained alongside hundreds of other prominent Saudis at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh, where he was reportedly electroshocked and whipped.
This all comes as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a confirmation hearing for retired four-star General John Abizaid to become U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. hasn't had an ambassador there for 2 years. Abizaid, who is of Lebanese descent, served as the head of U.S. Central Command from 2003 to 2007, overseeing much of the first 4 years of the U.S. occupation of Iraq. Abizaid's first combat experience took place in 1983 during the U.S. invasion of the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada. During Wednesday's hearing, Abizaid defended the U.S. relationship with the Saudi kingdom.
It is difficult to imagine a successful U.S. effort to undercut Sunni extremism or keep Iran in check without engaging and partnering with the kingdom. This is not to say that I am unaware of the challenges facing the U.S.-Saudi partnership today. War in Yemen, the senseless killing of Jamal Khashoggi, rifts in the Gulf Alliance, alleged abuses of innocent people to include an American citizen and female activists all present immediate challenges. Yet, in the long run, we need a strong and mature partnership with Saudi Arabia.
During the Senate hearing, Republican Senator Marco Rubio directly attacked Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
How do we balance all of this with this important regional and strategic partnership? Because this guy's making it harder. He's gone full gangster, and it's difficult to work with a guy like that, no matter how important the relationship is.
Senator Marco Rubio. To talk more about the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia and the nomination of General John Abizaid, we're joined by two guests. In Washington, D.C., retired Colonel, Vietnam War vet Andrew Bacevich. He recently wrote a piece for Le Monde Diplomatique headlined Abizaid of Arabia. He's the author of several books, including Twilight of the American Century, Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University. And here in New York, William Hartung, Director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Andrew Bacevich, let's begin with you. This hearing yesterday, and again, for the first time in 2 years, the possibility of having a U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Your assessment of John Abi Zaid?
Well, first of all, the fact that we haven't had an ambassador for 2 years, I think, suggests how important it is to have ambassadors. They don't make policy. General Abi Zaid won't make policy. U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia is made in Washington. More specifically, it's made in the White House. More specifically still, it appears to be made by the president's son-in-law. So Abi Zaid had a very successful career as a U.S. Army officer, finishing up four-star general, commanded Central Command. I think the highlight of his tenure as commander of Central Command occurred soon after he was appointed to the position. This is summer of 2003, after the fall of Baghdad, just as resistance to U.S. occupation is beginning to form. And the line offered by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld at that time was that the resistance was of no consequence. It was a few dead-enders, and that things were on track. And Abi Zaid, to his credit, had the courage to say, no, we are facing the beginnings of an insurgency, which was a correct assessment. The problem is that over the remaining course of his tenure as commander of Central Command, little of what he did resulted in an effective response to that insurgency. Things just kept getting worse. So kudos to him for a moment of honesty. But if we judge him against the great captains of history, he doesn't rate very highly.
And Bill Hartung, your assessment of Abu Zaid, his record, and Trump's decision to nominate him as the next ambassador to Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think the fact that he was head of Central Command during the height of the Iraq intervention alone should disqualify him from being ambassador. As Andrew Bacevich said, it's not a powerful post. It doesn't make policy. But I think it's the wrong signal. It puts a military face on a U.S. foreign policy that's already over-militarized. And I think his testimony, where he called things like the Yemen war and the murder of Khashoggi challenges, those aren't challenges. Those were crimes. And I think the fact that he's already soft-pedaling that doesn't bode well for how he would serve as ambassador.
Well, I'd like to go back to 2003, when then-President Bush stood on an aircraft carrier under a giant Mission Accomplished banner and declared the end of the war in Iraq.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
That's Bush's so-called Mission Accomplished speech in May of 2003, just weeks after the U.S. invaded Iraq. Andrew Bacevich, in your recent piece for Le Monde Diplomatique headlined Abi Zaid of Arabia, you point out that the following year, in 2004, John Abi Zaid coined the term the Long War, suggesting that the mission in Iraq was far from accomplished. Abi Zaid also said early on that the real threat to the U.S. in the region comes not from Iran or Iraq, but from Salafist jihadists, whose ideology both originates in and finds support from none other than, of course, Saudi Arabia. You go on to say, quote, there is more than a little poetic justice, or is it irony, in General Abu Zaid's proposed posting to Riyadh. The one senior military officer who early on demonstrated an inkling of understanding of the Long War's true nature now prepares to take up an assignment in what is, in essence, the very center of the enemy's camp, you wrote. So given what you've said, given Trump's extremely close alliance with Saudi Arabia, why do you think he's chosen to nominate possibly the one senior military figure who's identified Saudi Arabia itself as the source of so much conflict in the region itself and opposition to the interests of the U.S.?
Well, I think that based on General Abi Zaid's testimony at his confirmation hearings, he has abandoned the analysis that he had made back in 2003, 2004. Just the clip you played showed him basically reciting what has been the standard line with regard to the U.S.-Saudi relationship going back decades. That is to say that this partnership, as he called it, is of great strategic importance to the United States. And then, of course, he went on to recite, in a notably passionless way, the complaints that we have about Saudi policies and promising to give them due attention. So what is so striking, I think, here we are in 2019, so many years after the debacle that George W. Bush launched in 2003, and the conversation, the debate, such as it is, still remains superficial, and I think avoids confronting some of the basic contradictions. And at the center of the contradictions, really, is the conviction that somehow or another the United States has a vital interest in maintaining a partnership with Saudi Arabia. Virtually nobody within the foreign policy establishment is willing to examine that notion, and it's past time that we did examine it critically.
In 2008, General Abizaid made headlines for comments he made about the Middle East. At a conference at Stanford, General Abizaid admitted the Iraq war was over oil. He said, quote, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." He went on to say, quote, "We've treated the Arab world as a collection of big gas stations. Our message to them is, guys, keep your pumps open, prices low, be nice to the Israelis, and you can do whatever you want out back." Osama and 9/11 is the distilled essence that represents everything going on out back, he said. Your response, Andrew Bacevich?
Well, apparently he's forgotten that commentary, because he's now basically reciting the line, again, with regard to Saudi Arabia, that this is a strategically important country. What he said in 2008 is clear in the implication, and this is simply factually correct, that the American way of life that we once thought was dependent upon having access to Persian Gulf oil, is not. We don't need Persian Gulf oil. And yet that fact has not yet sunk in with the foreign policy establishment and provided a basis for a fundamental reevaluation, not only of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, but a reevaluation of the larger assumption that the Persian Gulf really, really matters to the well-being of the United States. It doesn't. And were we to accept that fact, then the possibility of rethinking U.S. policy in the region would become evident. Not simply reevaluating the relationship with Saudi Arabia, but reevaluating the assumption that Iran is somehow the great enemy that now threatens stability in the region. The real threat to stability in the region has been misguided U.S. policy over the past 2 decades.
But do you see the focus at all shifting, Andrew Bacevich, if his nomination, Abizaid's nomination, is confirmed, given what his positions were in the past?
No. I mean, I suppose he could become ambassador. Again, I really don't think ambassadors have all that much influence. I suppose he could become ambassador and then forget what he said yesterday in his confirmation hearings. But my expectation is that whoever he spoke to in the administration in order to get this appointment, that he assured the administration that he was going to play the game. Now, is there a possibility of change? I think so. Yesterday, if I can change the topic just slightly, I participated in an event sponsored by congressional progressives to talk about the possibility of creating a progressive framework for U.S. foreign policy. This would be a rather large project. Maybe it'll never occur. But the participants, I was struck by the extent to which the participants in that event are completely open to asking fundamental questions about some of these deeply embedded assumptions that guide U.S. policy. And one of those has to do with the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. So there are people on Capitol Hill in Washington who are willing to ask those questions. Whether or not they can forge a sufficient group to make a difference, I think remains to be seen.
I mean, it's very interesting to have a U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, given that many people might confuse Jared Kushner for that, or perhaps Secretary of State, or perhaps National Security Advisor. Because, you know, at the height of the split-screen news events of a few weeks ago, where Michael Cohen was testifying in the public hearing in Congress, the North Korea summit was happening in Vietnam, Jared Kushner slipped into Saudi Arabia, as we just said at the beginning of this segment, without consulting the U.S. embassy there, etc., and has this private meeting with the Saudi king and the crown prince, who he has been WhatsApping with and who apparently he is very close to. The significance of this New York developer, who, like his father-in-law, a developer here in New York, who becomes the senior advisor. Apparently, it was President Trump himself who, defying intelligence recommendations, gave him a top security clearance. And he goes and has whatever conversation he has with the Crown Prince, that first face-to-face meeting since the murder of Khashoggi. And I wanted to ask if you think anything will change. You write in your piece about this relationship the U.S. has with Saudi Arabia. You write, quote, next to oil, violent jihadism is Saudi Arabia's principal export. Indeed, the former funds the latter. Explain what you mean.
Well, I mean, this is well known, I think, that the Saudi royal family, in order to tamp down resistance, internal resistance to its rule, has played to ultra-conservative Muslim clerics by investing enormous sums in exporting ultra-conservative Islam in other parts of the world, and in effect underwriting organizations that end up conducting terrorist attacks not only against the United States but against other countries and other regimes. Now, there is some evidence that in recent years they have backed off from this tendency, but nonetheless, if we try to understand the origins of radical Islamism in some parts of the Muslim world, we have to recognize the important role that Saudi Arabia has played in creating this problem. And further, we have to recognize that the U.S. efforts to respond to that problem by invading countries and bombing countries and overthrowing regimes has not dampened the problem down, but has actually worsened it. So in that sense, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is at the very nexus of is one of the principal sources of the instability that plagues the region at the present moment.
Well, Andrew Bacevich, as you say, of course, these Salafist groups that Saudi Arabia has supported, of course, many of those groups have come to attack the U.S. and Europe. But, of course, the principal victims of those groups are Muslims in the Muslim world and the Arab world. Could you elaborate on what some of the effects of these groups and this violence has been on the region itself, the ongoing wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, what's been unfolding in Yemen? If you could say a little bit about the role of these groups.
I wish I had come armed with statistics because they are depressing. But if we would take 2003 as the start date, 2001 perhaps better, when we invaded Afghanistan, as the start date for this destabilizing military project that we have been involved in ever since, we've killed hundreds of thousands of people. We have displaced millions, creating huge refugee problems. If Americans care about it, we've spent trillions of dollars of American taxpayer money. We have, of course, lost thousands of our own soldiers, and there are tens of thousands of veterans who have had their lives shattered, irreparably shattered as a result of their military service in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I have to say, one of the things that I find so disturbing about the present political moment, as we obsess about Donald Trump, and there's plenty of reason to obsess about Donald Trump, is that all the rest of this sequence of events somehow it gets lost, doesn't find any purchase in the American collective consciousness. And I think that that failure, that moral failure on our part to take measure of the evil that we have perpetrated over the past couple of years is a judgment on the part of the American people. We don't care, to put it bluntly, the collective we don't care about the havoc that we have caused in a large part of the world, and we are too easy to forget and to move on, or to turn our attention to other issues like, Donald Trump.
Very quickly, before you leave, Andrew Bacevich, I'm wondering if you could weigh in, as you talked about progressive foreign policy meeting you were having yesterday, on the battle royale that's being waged in Congress right now around an anti-Semitism resolution, with a lot of first-term Congress members, younger progressive Congress members, really pushing back and saying if we're going to have this kind of resolution, it has to be against racism, it has to be against Islamophobia as well. It's apparently targeting Ilhan Omar, the Congress member from Minneapolis, questioning the U.S. relationship with Israel, who said last week political influence in this country that says it's okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country, referring to Israel. She has said she calls out the fossil fuel industry. She calls out the NRA, and that the lobby for the right-wing government of Israel right now is very powerful. What is your take on this? You have Bernie Sanders weighing in and saying being critical of Israel. I mean, you have the prime minister who's about to be indicted. Bernie Sanders says being critical of Israel is not being anti-Semitic. Of course, Bernie Sanders, Jewish himself. Your thoughts?
Well, it has not been possible it's not been permissible to have an honest conversation about the U.S.-Israeli relationship and about Israeli policies, particularly with regard to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. To insist on having that honest conversation is to invite punishment, and we're seeing that again today. And yet again, and I sense this in this forum that I participated in yesterday in the House of Representatives, I sense that something may be turning, that there's an inkling of a possibility of openness on these matters. And I would argue that the honesty is greatly needed, not simply about the U.S. relationship with Israel, but on a whole host of other issues, to include the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. So one of the ironic effects of the Trump moment and the bizarre approach to policy undertaken by the Trump administration may be to further that opening. We'll see what's going to happen. But it does make for an interesting time.
Well, we want to thank you very much for being with us, Andrew Bacevich, retired Colonel, Professor Emeritus at Boston University. William Hartung will be staying with us to talk about his latest report on the arming of the Saudi UAE bombing campaign in Yemen, weapons provided by the U.S. and Britain, among others. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
It's not a game to me. This is not a This is not a game to me. This is not a They said he was a danger. He ruined his last name. His daughter, she's a singer. Put her family to shame. What should we do to fix her? She's covered in her tears. But people go through so much worse, and that is what she
Wonder Game by Tam here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
As Yemen faces the world's worst humanitarian crisis, we turn now to a major new report documenting the role that the U.S. and Europe have played in the deaths of hundreds of civilians in the U.S.-backed Saudi and UAE-led war on Yemen. A group of organizations, including a Yemen-based human rights group, released the damning report on Wednesday, claiming that between April 2015 and April 2018, 27 coalition attacks killed at least 203 civilians and injured at least 749 people. The report found that 22 of the attacks likely involved weapons produced in the United States. The other 5 attacks were carried out with weapons either produced in the United Kingdom or with parts produced in both the US and the UK. Radia Al-Mutawakkil, the chair of Matwana for Human Rights, the Yemeni group that helped write the report, testified Wednesday before a House subcommittee on the report's findings.
Matwana has documented hundreds of attacks, killing and maiming thousands of civilians and destroying key infrastructure. We found U.S. bomb remnants at dozens of these airstrikes. Many are likely war crimes. Every single one destroyed innocent lives. The 2016 Saudi bombing of a Sana'a funeral hall using U.S. munitions, killing and maiming hundreds, should have been a turning point. Congress should have stopped arms sales until unlawful attacks ended and war criminals were held accountable. Instead, the U.S. accepted Saudi and Emirati promises to end violations and investigate. 2 years later, there has been no accountability, and airstrikes on Yemeni civilians continue.
The human rights group that Radia Al-Mutawakkil represents documented 128 apparently unlawful coalition airstrikes in 2018 that killed 418 civilians, including 181 children. During this time, they also observed armed Houthi rebels commit violations against Yemeni people, including laying landmines, shelling civilians, arbitrarily detaining scores of people. The report warns, despite ongoing coalition abuses, the U.S. continues to sell Saudi Arabia and the UAE weapons for use in Yemen in violation of domestic and international law. The UK, too, continues arms sales in violation of its obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty and the EU Common Position on Military Exports. Well, for more, we are joined by Radia Al-Mutawakkil, chairperson of Matwana Organization for Human Rights, one of the groups that published the report. It's titled Day of Judgment, the Role of the U.S. and Europe in Civilian Death, Destruction, and Trauma in Yemen. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you start off, Radia, by telling us the message you conveyed to Congress yesterday? What is most important for us to understand about your country, Yemen, where you live in the capital, Sana'a?
First, I wanted the Congress to know that they can change the fates of Yemenis. They can play a very positive role to end the war. But instead of this, they are supporting Saudis and Emiratis blindly, not only by selling weapons, but also by military and political support. So I wanted them just to try to shift this and to play a positive role to end the war in Yemen, which is very possible. It just needs a will from the Congress and the international community in general.
Well, Radia, can you talk about some of the questions that you were asked during the hearing? And also, you live in Yemen. Were you able to convey to them, the Congress members who were present at the hearing, what conditions there are like?
Well, Yemenis, they are surrounded by death every day, not only by the Saudi and Emirati airstrikes. It's one very important thing, but the death is much more than this on Yemenis, and it is a very preventable war. So Yemenis, they feel sad because they feel that they are dying because of nothing, and this just can't stop anytime. Millions of Yemenis now are not receiving their salaries, and in some areas, they are controlled by the armed groups, which is called Houthis, in a very difficult situation. But also in the areas that is controlled by Hadi government and the coalition, people are just living in a very bad situation and facing a lot of violations. So, and the war, it's just empowering fanatic groups in Yemen. It just, with no view, there is no peace plan, no war plan by parties to the conflict in Yemen.
Can you talk about how Yemenis come to understand who the U.S. is? Can you talk about finding the weapons parts, the bomb ordnance, and what they say on them?
So Yemenis now, they know that U.S. are involved negatively in the war in Yemen. And in the cases we have documented and we found U.S. remnant weapons, many Yemenis, they have never been to America. But what is really sad that America reached them through the weapons that destroys their lives and killed their families. America should reach Yemenis with education, with technology, positive one, not with weapons. What was happening that they are receiving America like just weapons.
Well, I'd like to bring Ruhan Nagra into the conversation to talk about one of the incidents that the report documents. In April 2018, a coalition airstrike tore through a wedding party, killing at least 21 people in the Bani Qais district in northern Yemen. The bride was also among those killed. Almost 60 children were injured. At the scene of the bombing, one man lashed out at Saudi Arabia.
They always target weddings. They kill children and innocent people. But we can only complain to God, not to any human rights or any country in the world.
We're also joined now by Ruhan Nagra, Executive Director of the University Network for Human Rights and co-author of this new report, which found that the bomb used in this attack on the wedding party was U.S.-made. The mother of the groom is cited in the report as saying, quote, "The blood was everywhere. Fingers and intestines were in all directions. Body parts were on trees and rocks, and people tried to collect as many of them as possible, and the remaining body parts were eaten by dogs," the report says. What kind of bomb, Ruhan, was used in this attack? It was a U.S. bomb. How common were these incidents, and how were you able to confirm the origins of the bomb?
This attack, in which 118 civilians died, including nearly half of them children, this attack happened at the hands of a U.S.-made paveway bomb, and there are actually 14 of the 27 incidents that we've documented in this report involved U.S.-made paveway bombs. Official 2017 congressional notifications of proposed weapons sales to Saudi Arabia included nearly $300 million of proposed sales of paveway bombs. In this particular incident, there was a joyous wedding celebration happening. There were about 150 to 200 wedding guests gathered. There were dancers dancing. There were drummers drumming. And all of a sudden, this U.S.-made bomb explodes on the scene and wreaks utter devastation. The mother of the groom who you cited also said that after the attack, she collected the garlands made of jasmine flowers that some of the guests had been wearing, and those garlands were mingled with human flesh and blood. Another guest described collecting body parts from the multiple people who were killed and burying them and not knowing which body part belonged to whom. So this incident very much speaks to the pattern of U.S. Involvement in unlawful coalition airstrikes that we've documented in this report. Of the 27 attacks documented, all but 2 of them involved likely U.S.-made weapons. There's been a lot of talk in recent years, in the last couple of years, about the risk of U.S. weapons being used unlawfully in Yemen. This report presents the most comprehensive evidence to date that this is not a hypothetical risk, that U.S. weapons are actually being used in apparently unlawful coalition airstrikes in Yemen.
And can you talk about the use of cluster munitions, giving an example, the effects of these weapons in 5 of the 27 incidents you document, 5 used U.S.-made cluster munitions, and talk about the legality of this?
Yes. So, yes, that's exactly right. In 5 of the 27 attacks we documented, U.S. cluster munitions were used. These are highly lethal weapons. There's a growing international consensus around a ban on cluster munitions, as exemplified by the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Unfortunately, the U.S. is not a party to that convention. However, U.S. transfer of cluster munitions to Saudi Arabia and the UAE is still unlawful under U.S. domestic policies on cluster munition exports. Cluster munitions are inherently indiscriminate weapons. It is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for cluster munitions to be used in compliance with international humanitarian law. That's because they release submunitions which disperse widely and with indiscriminate effects. Some of them release submunitions over an area that spans about 5 football fields. So it's virtually impossible to constrain the effects that these weapons have, especially when they're used in populated areas. And in the 5 attacks that we documented in this report, in which cluster munitions were used, they were all used in populated areas where high civilian casualties were an extremely likely outcome. Just to give you one example of the 5. A U.S.-made cluster munition was dropped on a civilian household in one of the strikes we documented. 22 people were killed. 22 civilians were killed. Half of them were children. One of the children who was injured in the attack was a 10-year-old boy named Ahmed Mansour. He lost his mother and all of his siblings in that attack. So if you can just imagine a 10-year-old boy with no mother, with no brothers and sisters, all at the hands of a U.S.-made cluster weapon that should never have been manufactured in the first place, let alone then sold to a brutal, murderous regime with a horrendous human rights record.
We're going to break and come back to this discussion. Ruhan Nagra with us and Radia Al-Mutawakkil, who testified before Congress yesterday. Their report is Day of Judgment, the role of the U.S. and Europe in civilian death, destruction and trauma in Yemen. Bill Hartung will also join us about his report on weapons being used to kill the people of Yemen. Stay with us.
Of the brokenness inside, I am light. I am light.
I Am Light by India Ree, here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
As we continue our conversation of the U.S.-backed Saudi and UAE-led war on Yemen, I want to bring into this conversation William Hartung. He's the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. He recently wrote a report titled Little Sparta, the United States, United Arab Emirates Alliance and the War in Yemen. So welcome back to Democracy Now! Bill, can you talk about this? Why is the UAE, first of all, referred to as Little Sparta, and by whom?
Well, people like Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, have called them that because he is akin to the Greek city-state, which is a warrior state. So he's saying that they're good warriors, but of course they're putting their warrior skills to very devastating results, which none of us should be supporting. I should point out that we can stop this. And next week, there's a vote on a Sanders-Lee amendment, Mike Lee, the Republican, Bernie Sanders, to stop U.S. support for both the UAE and Saudi Arabia, our military support for the war in Yemen. So I think there's still some people on the fence about that. I think that's important to push forward, both in its own right and to put leverage on the peace process. So, the crimes of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Congress has it in its hands to play a role in stopping them, which I think is important.
I mean, it is amazing what is happening there. You have Nick Turse reporting for Yahoo News. Despite denials, documents reveal U.S. training UAE forces for combat in Yemen. The U.S. is training them. What about this U.S., UAE, and Saudi relationship and the power of the military contractors that are benefiting from all of this, that are having their heyday under President Trump?
Well, on the UAE side, the U.S. has supplied $27 billion in weapons in the last decade, trained 5,000 troops, including those pilots for combat. Our special forces work closely with them on the ground. And the UAE has engaged in torture. They've hired mercenaries and child soldiers, including from Sudan, like the Janjaweed militias. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing are profiting directly from this war and have lobbied for these arms sales, even after the Khashoggi murder. So, there's profit, there's criminal activity, and there's been unswerving support for the Trump administration. So really it's up to activists who've done a tremendous job of moving the Congress and for Congress to live up to its responsibilities, I think, if we're going to stop this.
Well, Radia, can you talk about this? I mean, the involvement of the United Arab Emirates, I mean, it's a tiny little Gulf state, how it came to occupy this oversized position in the region, and also the number of European countries that have now either suspended or cancelled arms sales to the UAE and Saudi Arabia following Khashoggi's murder and the continuing devastation of Yemen at their hands.
First, the United Arab Emirates, they have a very big control in the south areas, and which is really strange that they, as I said, they are empowering fanatic extremist groups, and they also control some what is called the security belts and other security groups, and they are just doing a very horrible violations, detention, torture, forced disappearance, and they are dealing with the area, with Yemen, as there is no people. They have their own project, and they're dealing with us like a land with no people. They didn't even try to provide the services in the areas that they are controlling, and they can do it for people, but they don't care. For the European countries, there are some European countries who already stopped selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates even before the Khashoggi case, like Netherlands and then Germany. But still, one of the European countries who are really selling weapons to Saudis is France, and they didn't stop until now.
In your final call, Radia, in Congress yesterday, to be there as a woman from Sana'a, the capital, if you can explain what you said to the Congress members.
Well, it was strange to me that many members in the Congress were just focusing in the humanitarian access. And humanitarian access is important, but while we are in the Congress, we can talk about how to stop the war, not only how to make the humanitarian access easily, because even humanitarian NGOs are saying that humanitarian aid will not solve the problem in Yemen. In 2018, there was 22 million people need a kind of humanitarian assistance. And now in 2019, the number increased to 24 million. So you cannot feed a nation. I'm so scared that to be here in 2020 saying that the number increased. This should stop. And I try to explain to the Congress that they can do a lot to stop the war in Yemen. It's a humanitarian disaster that they have the power to stop it. And they can get benefit from the power they have to do this.
Radia, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Radia Altumakal is chairperson of the Moatana Organization for Human Rights, Ruhan Nagra, executive director of the University Network for Human Rights. We're going to link to your piece, your report on the role of the U.S. and Europe, the role that it's played in the deaths of hundreds of civilians in the U.S.-backed Saudi UAE-led war in Yemen. And thanks, Bill. We'll also link to your report, William Hartung, director of the Arms and Security Project Center for International Policy. That does it for our show. I'll be speaking in Denver March 15th at the historic East High School. Check our website at DemocracyNow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Tarina Nadura, Tay-Marie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineers. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.